South Florida has hired 25 top hunters to capture and kill the snakes. A nearly 17-foot-long python was killed last week. Now, it is the longest captured so far in this program.
Florida has a massive snake problem. We all know that, but their solution wasn't just to hire more hunters. They decided to release an army of more snakes into the wild,
upsetting the delicate balance in the Everglades, which is home to endangered species like the Florida panther. And they can pose a risk to humans too. While Burmese pythons typically stay far away from us, they can strike and constrict to defend themselves.
It sounds like a joke, but the plan was real. And what happened next was not what anyone expected. It was something darker, something that spreads unseen, and it's turning the Everglades into a real-life horror story. We're going to talk about the pythons, the snake killers Florida unleashed, and the terrifying consequence that no one saw coming. How it all began. Long before the chaos, the Florida Everglades was a sprawling, vibrant wilderness. It was often called the River of Grass. This was a slow-moving sheet of water stretching 100 miles from Lake Okeechobee down to the tip of the state. This wasn't just a swamp, it was a one-of-a-kind ecosystem, a subtropical wetland teeming with life. Imagine a place so alive you could hear it. Flocks of wading birds, like egrets and herons, were so vast they would darken the sky. Raccoons, opossums, and bobcats hunted along the watery edges. White-tailed deer moved through the patches of dry land. And at the top, the American alligator reigned as the apex predator. This intricate web of life was the wild heart of Florida, an ecological treasure valued at over $31 billion every single year for its role in tourism, fishing, and providing fresh water for millions of people. It was a balanced system. It was, until it wasn't. The beginning of the end didn't happen all at once. It started in 1992 with Hurricane Andrew. This monster storm ripped through South Florida with devastating force. It flattened homes and businesses. And get this, it also destroyed several exotic pet breeding facilities. In the chaos, an unknown number of Burmese pythons, native to Southeast Asia, slipped away into the wetlands. At the same time, another problem was brewing. During the 1980s, Burmese pythons were the it pet. People bought them as tiny, manageable snakes. But here's the catch, they don't stay tiny. These snakes grow, and they grow fast. A 10-inch baby can become a 10-foot giant in just a few years. Suddenly, pet owners were stuck with massive, powerful predators that could eat a small dog. Overwhelmed, many of them did the unthinkable. They drove to the edge of the Everglades and just let them go. They thought they were giving their pets a chance at freedom. What they were really doing was lighting a fuse. For years, nobody noticed. A few sightings here and there were dismissed, but the Everglades was the perfect new home for these invaders. It was warm, it was wet, and it was a giant open buffet. What most people don't realize is just how perfectly these snakes are built to take over. First, they are masters of camouflage. Their patterned skin makes them virtually invisible in the dappled light of the swamp. You could be standing 5 feet from a 10-foot python and never know it. Second, they are ambush predators. They wait perfectly still for days or even weeks until food walks right by. Then they strike with incredible speed, grabbing their prey and coiling around it. And the crazy part is their breeding. A single female python can lay a clutch of up to 100 eggs at a time. In their native Asia, predators like king cobras and leopards would eat the eggs and young snakes, keeping the numbers in check. But in Florida, they had no natural enemies. Nothing. They were at the top of the food chain right next to the alligator. By the early 2000s, scientists began to sound the alarm. The paradise was falling silent. The numbers that came out were not just bad, they were horrifying. A landmark study revealed that in the hardest hit areas of the Everglades, the mammal population had completely collapsed. Raccoon populations dropped by 99.3%. Opossums? Gone. Down 98.9%. Bobcats, once common, had dropped by 87.5%, marsh rabbits and foxes. They had effectively vanished. The pythons were literally swallowing the Everglades whole. These snakes can eat almost anything, their jaws unhinged to swallow prey many times wider than their own heads. Biologists have found deer inside them. They've found alligators, they've even found wading birds, proving the snakes were impacting every part of the food web. The state was facing an ecological disaster on a scale it had never seen. The invaders weren't just living in the Everglades, they were consuming it. They were spreading north, with estimates putting their population in the hundreds of thousands, maybe more. The $31 billion ecosystem was being dismantled from the inside out by a monster that humans had created. Everyone was obsessed with the pythons, these giant, obvious monsters. But as we'll see, the real horror was something else entirely. It was something they brought with them, something small, unseen, and far more terrifying. But first, Florida had to try and fight the monster it could see. The state was desperate, and that desperation led to a full-on war. An unwinnable fight. So here's the deal. Florida had a full-blown invasion on its hands. The problem was, how do you fight an enemy that's invisible and multiplies by the hundreds? The first, most obvious answer, call in the hunters. This turned into a massive headline-grabbing spectacle. In 2013, the state launched the first Florida Python Challenge. It was part science, part publicity stunt, and part Wild West bounty hunt. Hundreds of people from all over the country and even other parts of the world descended on the Everglades. They came with snake hooks, traps, and a whole lot of confidence, all competing for cash prizes. The media loved it. It was a great story. Brave hunters wading into the swamp to fight giant snakes and save the ecosystem. And year after year, the event grew. They managed to remove 195 Burmese pythons. The winner walked away with a $10,000 grand prize. In 2025, they broke another record, pulling 294 pythons from the swamp. It all sounds impressive. But here's the catch, it wasn't working. 294 snakes, that's it. When the estimated population is in the hundreds of thousands, removing a few hundred is like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. The pythons were breeding far, far faster than the hunters could ever catch them. For every snake they pulled out, 1,000 more were likely hatching somewhere hidden in the grass. The state knew this wasn't enough, so they upped the ante. They hired professionals. The South Florida Water Management District created a full-time, paid team of about 24 elite python hunters. These weren't weekend warriors. These were experts paid an hourly wage, plus a bonus for every snake they caught and an extra bonus for every foot of snake. They were given access to remote lands, ATVs, and all the gear they needed. And these hunters are good. They've removed thousands of snakes over the years. One famous hunter, Dusty the Wild Man Crumb, became a local legend, catching pythons with his bare hands. But even this professional army was just slowing the spread. They were, at best, a holding action. They could clear pythons from a specific area, like a levee or a tree island, but they couldn't stop the endless wave. Yeah, about that. The state got desperate. If hunters on the ground couldn't find them, maybe technology could. This is where the war against the pythons started to look like a science fiction movie. Engineers and biologists teamed up to create high-tech solutions. They designed robotic rabbits that gave off heat and a scent to lure pythons into traps. They deployed teams of detector dogs, specially trained to sniff out the unique scent of a python, leading hunters through the dense brush. They flew drones equipped with thermal imaging cameras over the wetlands, hoping to spot the cold-blooded snakes warming themselves in the sun. But the pythons, it turned out, were smarter than the tech. The thermal cameras couldn't easily tell the difference between a warm rock and a snake. The dogs were amazing, but they could only cover so much ground. So, scientists tried the most dramatic idea yet, using the pythons against themselves. They captured several large male pythons and surgically implanted tiny radio transmitters inside them. They called these scout snakes. The plan was to release them during breeding season and follow them. The theory was simple. A male python is better at finding a female python than any human could ever be. The scouts would lead the scientists right to the large, egg-laying females. And it kind of worked. They would follow a scout snake, like Argo, for miles until he stopped. The team would move in and find him coiled up with a massive 17-foot female, which they would then capture and remove. But this was incredibly expensive, time-consuming, and hard work, and it still only removed one snake at a time. The frustration was piling up. Florida was spending millions of dollars. They had an army of amateurs, a team of professionals, and a lab full of high-tech gadgets. And after all that, they had barely made a dent. The pythons were still winning. Scientists had to admit a hard truth. Full eradication or wiping them out completely was impossible. The pythons were a permanent part of the Florida landscape. The state was at a breaking point. Every solution had failed, and all this time, while everyone was watching the giant snakes, the real horror was spreading. The python's most terrifying weapon was something no one could see: the parasite's curse. What if the python's worst damage wasn't from their bite, but from their blood? What most people don't realize is that when the Burmese pythons arrived, they weren't alone. They carried a silent, microscopic passenger, a hitchhiker. And this tiny organism is now at the center of a new nightmare, one that is truly the stuff of horror films. It's a parasite, specifically a type of lungworm. Deep inside the lungs and airways of the pythons, these tiny, thread-like worms lived. In their native Asia, the pythons had evolved with these parasites for thousands of years. They had a natural resistance. The worms were an annoyance, but not a serious threat. But when those pythons were released into Florida, they introduced this parasite to a place that had never seen it before. The native snakes of the Everglades, the water snakes, the garter snakes, the king snakes, had zero natural defense against it. It was like a brand new plague. So here's the deal with how it spreads. It's a truly twisted life cycle. The adult worms live in the python's lungs and lay eggs. The python coughs up these eggs, swallows them, and then passes them out into the wild in its droppings. Then, things get weird. Those droppings are eaten by scavengers like cockroaches. The worm's eggs hatch inside the cockroach and wait. Then a native frog or a lizard comes along and eats that cockroach. The parasite is now inside the frog, but it still can't grow. It just waits. Finally, a native Florida snake, like a black racer or a cottonmouth, eats that infected frog. Once inside its new snake host, the parasite goes to work. The larvae wake up. They burrow out of the snake's stomach and travel through its body until they find the lungs. There they attach themselves and begin to grow, feeding on the snake's blood and tissue. For the native snakes, this is a terrible slow-motion ending. The worms multiply, clogging their airways. Breathing becomes a struggle. The snakes get sick. They can't hunt, they grow weak and starve. Researchers have found native snakes that are literally choking. Their lungs so full of parasites there's no room for air. And get this, the crazy part is what researchers saw when they examined these native snakes. They found snakes with severe pneumonia. They found open bleeding sores inside their lungs. In some of the worst cases, when a snake was captured, dozens of these pale, wiggling worms would crawl out of the snake's mouth and nose. It's a genuinely terrifying sight. At first, scientists thought this was just another sad part of the python story, but then they realized the parasite was spreading on its own. The pythons were the original source, but the parasite had found a new home. It was now moving from native snake to native snake, creating a self-sustaining plague. Scientists were stunned. They found the lungworm in 18 different species of native Florida snakes. This plague is now spreading faster and farther than the pythons themselves. The pythons are mostly in South Florida, but the lungworm has been found in snakes hundreds of miles north, all the way up near Jacksonville, and even spreading toward the Florida Panhandle. It's an invisible invasion, moving silently through the state's ecosystem, and there is absolutely no way to stop it. We can't treat it. We can't cure it. We can't round up every snake in Florida. Every native snake that perishes from this parasite becomes food for something else, spreading the problem even further. This is the horror film consequence. The pythons didn't just come to eat the Everglades, they came to infect it. They brought a biological weapon, and Florida's native snakes are paying the price. This discovery changed everything. The war wasn't just about removing giant snakes anymore, it was about a sickness that could wipe out Florida's own snake populations. The very animals needed to keep the ecosystem in balance. The state was failing to stop the pythons, and now they were facing a new, invisible enemy. The situation seemed hopeless. That's when Florida made its most crazy move yet. If you can't beat the invader, what if you bring in an emperor? The Black Snake's secret. Faced with a failing war and a new horrifying plague, Florida officials greenlit a plan that on the surface sounded like total madness. When the news broke, the public and the media had a field day. People laughed, they made jokes, they couldn't believe it. The plan? To fight the invasive snake problem by releasing hundreds of more snakes into the wild. To the average person, this was the definition of a Florida man headline. The state was already overrun with snakes. Why on earth would they add more? It sounded reckless, stupid, and like a disaster just waiting to happen. People everywhere compared it to that old story of Hawaii introducing mongooses to eat rats, only to have the mongooses ignore the rats and wipe out the native birds instead. The skepticism was intense. Residents were worried. Would these new snakes be in their backyards? Were they venomous? Had the state completely lost its mind? But here's the catch. What most people didn't realize was that this wasn't just any snake, and this wasn't a crazy idea. It was a deeply scientific, calculated plan decades in the making. The snake they were releasing was a missing piece of Florida's original ecosystem. They were releasing the eastern indigo snake. And the eastern indigo is not just another snake, it's nicknamed the Emperor of the Forest, and for very good reason. Growing up to 9 feet long, the eastern indigo is the longest native snake in North America. It's a beautiful animal with smooth, iridescent scales that shimmer a glossy blue-black in the sun. It's powerful, intelligent, and has the calm confidence of a true apex predator. But it has one very special, very important secret. The eastern indigo snake eats other snakes. Its diet is incredibly varied. It eats birds, rodents, frogs, and turtle eggs, but its specialty, its main course, is other snakes. And get this, it is completely immune to the venom of North America's pit vipers. This emperor will calmly hunt down, overpower, and swallow eastern diamondback rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, and copperheads. It doesn't constrict them. It just pins them with its powerful jaws and swallows them. This was the animal that was supposed to be keeping Florida's other snake populations in balance. This was nature's own snake hunter. And it was gone. The crazy part is that the indigo snake's own story is a tragedy. They once roamed all over the American Southeast from South Carolina and Georgia down through Florida. But their habitat, the ancient longleaf pine forests, was destroyed by logging. Over 97% of it was cut down. At the same time, people hunted them for the pet trade, and many were accidentally ended when hunters gassed gopher tortoise burrows to get rattlesnakes. The indigos used those same burrows to shelter and nest. By 1978, the eastern indigo snake was listed as a threatened species. It had almost vanished. The emperor had been dethroned. So this new plan wasn't about introducing a new animal. It was about restoring the rightful king. For years, scientists at conservation centers had been working quietly behind the scenes. They were running a massive, complex breeding program. They were raising these snakes in captivity, carefully tracking their genetics. At the same time, other teams were working to restore the longleaf pine forests, planting new trees, and managing the land. They were bringing back the gopher tortoises to provide the burrows the snakes need. This wasn't a desperate gamble. It was a painstaking scientific restoration. The plan was to release these captive-bred snake killers back into protected areas, hoping they would build a new wild population. The hope was twofold. First, to save this magnificent native species from extinction, and second, to rebalance the ecosystem. The scientists knew the indigos couldn't eat all the pythons, but they could hunt and eat the juvenile pythons, the young ones that other predators couldn't handle. They could compete with the pythons for food. They could, in time, become the army of snake killers that Florida so badly needed. The public was laughing at the headlines, but the scientists were holding their breath, watching as the first black emperors slithered back into the Florida wilderness. The war had a new soldier, but was nature itself already fighting back? The unseen victory. For 2 decades, the Burmese python had been the undisputed, unstoppable monster of the Everglades. It had no predators. It feared nothing. Or so everyone thought. These were ghosts in the water, silent assassins in the sawgrass. They didn't just move into the ecosystem, they consumed it. Reports came in one after another, painting a grim picture. The populations of raccoons, possums, and bobcats had crashed, down by over 90% in some areas. These snakes were ecological black holes, swallowing whole deer and even the occasional alligator. They were breeding at an explosive rate, a single female laying up to 100 eggs. The balance of a wilderness that had existed for millennia was broken. The python was king, and its reign was absolute. Then, one December morning, the script flipped in the most shocking way possible. Researchers in a remote Florida preserve were tracking a male python they had named Loki. This wasn't a small snake. Loki was 13 feet long and weighed 52 pounds. He was fitted with a GPS tracker as part of a breeding study. Loki was a valuable asset to science. By tracking him, researchers could learn where these giant snakes went, how they mated, and where they hid. His data was crucial to understanding the invasion. The scientists watched his signal as he moved, believing he was on the hunt for a female. His movements were predictable. A slide through the water here, a long pause to bask in the sun there. It was just another day in the swamp. Then his tracker sent out a mortality signal. Suddenly, the data flatlined. The signal pinged from the same location over and over for hours. It meant he hadn't moved in a long time. The signal is a grim, digital tombstone. The team went in, their minds racing. What could have happened? A sudden cold snap can be lethal to these tropical giants. Maybe he'd been injured in a fight with another male python. They prepared themselves to perform a necropsy on a massive, intact snake. What they found left them speechless. The air was still. There was no sign of a struggle, no thrashed bushes at first. Just Loki's massive patterned body sprawled in the grass, looking almost peaceful, except for the gruesome, bloody stump where his head should have been. Loki's head was gone. The team was baffled. This was not a natural death. This was a kill. Scavengers might pick at a carcass, but this was different. The head was severed almost surgically. They began to search the area like detectives at a crime scene, and that's when they found it, hidden carefully under a nearby bed of pine needles. The head. It had been completely, systematically chewed off. This was not the work of a small scavenger. This was an ambush, a fight. The evidence pointed to a predator, not a scavenger. A scavenger eats to survive. This felt almost personal. But the question that hung in the humid air was terrifying. What could possibly take down a 52-pound python? An alligator? An alligator was the obvious first guess. They were the other apex predator. But the body was on dry land, and the kill method seemed wrong. An alligator would have death-rolled, likely tearing the snake into pieces or swallowing it whole. A panther? The elusive, endangered Florida panther? It was possible. Panthers are powerful ambush predators, but even a panther would struggle with a snake this large. The fight would have been epic, and the scene would have been torn apart. This was neater. The researchers set up trail cameras. They left Loki's body where it lay and encircled the area with motion-activated cameras, hoping the killer would return to its prize. A few days later, they retrieved the footage. They gathered around the monitor, pressed play, and watched in disbelief. The culprit was caught on video. It wasn't a panther, it wasn't an alligator, it was a native bobcat. A bobcat that weighed at most 25 pounds. The footage showed the cat looking almost casual, dragging the massive head and caching it. It had returned to feed on the body. This discovery stunned everyone. A creature weighing half the python size had managed to stalk, ambush, and take down one of the Everglades' top predators. How was this even possible? It was a classic case of predator-prey mismatch, but the roles were reversed. Experts theorized the bobcat used its superior agility and intelligence. It likely stalked Loki, waited for the perfect moment, and launched a lightning-fast attack on the head. A flurry of claws and teeth aimed at the one vulnerable spot. The python's only weapon, its constriction, was useless if it couldn't see or think. Wildlife experts called it a first. It was a brutal, hard-won victory. And it was a sign. What most people don't realize is that nature adapts. After 20 years of being terrorized, Florida's native predators were finally learning. A new generation was being born into a world where pythons were a fact of life. They were recognizing this new creature not just as a threat, but as food. This wasn't an isolated case. The bobcat was just the beginning. Soon, more evidence started to surface. Alligators, the other apex predator, were seen hunting and eating pythons. Video emerged of a massive gator clamping down on a python in the middle of a waterway, ending the fight before it began. The old kings were reasserting their dominance. Elusive Florida panthers, themselves an endangered species, were documented taking them on necropsies on dead panthers, sometimes revealed python scales in their stomachs. They were fighting for their territory. And yes, those same eastern indigo snakes, the emperors from the Restoration Project, were filmed in the wild, using their immunity to venom and their powerful jaws to consume juvenile Burmese pythons. The Everglades, which had been a buffet for the pythons, was starting to fight back. One biologist called it a score for the home team. But what about that army Florida released? What about the Indigo Snake Project that everyone laughed at? For years, this restoration had been a background story overshadowed by the flashy, media-friendly Python Challenge. It was the slow, unglamorous work of science. Releasing a few dozen snakes into a massive preserve seemed like a joke compared to the scale of the python invasion. It was like trying to put out a forest fire with a squirt gun. Or so the critics said. But the biologists knew something the public didn't. You don't fight an invasion with just defense. You have to re-establish the original rulers. In the autumn of 2023, scientists got the news they had been dreaming of. In the Apalachicola Bluffs Preserve, a place where they had been releasing captive-bred indigos for years, trail cameras captured something new, not another tagged, released adult, but two tiny, wild-born hatchlings of the eastern indigo snake. Biologists confirmed the young snakes had no tags, meaning they were not part of the release program. They were the offspring of the snakes that had been set free. This was the moment. For the first time in nearly half a century, the eastern indigo snake was successfully reproducing in the wild in North Florida. It was a miracle. The project was working. By 2025, the good news kept coming. Teams spotted a strong 6-foot male indigo moving confidently through the restored forests. They identified 19 other snakes from earlier releases, all still thriving. The emperors weren't just surviving, they were building a kingdom. They were reoccupying the burrows, hunting the local prey, and most importantly, adding their own numbers to the fight, all without human help. The pythons brought a plague, but Florida brought back an emperor. But is it too late? Is it even possible to fix a broken ecosystem? Let us know your thoughts below and don't forget to like and subscribe.